When someone can't let go emotionally, it's not always because they're still in love. It's often because they're still entangled, psychologically, spiritually, and in terms of identity. You have to understand something fundamental about the human psyche. We don't just form attachments to people, we form attachment to who we are when we're with them. And that's where the emotional grip tightens. She doesn't just miss you, she misses who she became in your presence. She misses the reflection of herself she saw in your eyes. That version of her was likely softer, more wanted, more secure, or perhaps more alive, more validated, more significant. You weren't just a partner. You were a mirror, a role, a container for her evolving identity. This is why, when you walk away, she feels like she's been stripped of something far deeper than just a relationship. It's the dismantling of a version of herself that she may have grown dependent on. And people don't release what they've built their identity on easily, especially not when they've poured into it emotionally, mentally, and in many cases, even spiritually. That attachment becomes less about love and more about preservation of the self. It's not, I can't live without you. It's, I don't know who I am without you. This is why silence hurts so deeply. This is why distance creates panic. It's not always that she's trying to pull you back because she wants to love you well. It's that your absence represents a fracture in her own narrative. She can't finish the story in her head. She can't reconcile the identity she formed with you with the one she has to step into without you. That transition is painful, it's disorienting, and so she clings not because she's weak, but because she's been using the relationship as a scaffolding for her own self-concept. You see, in any relationship, both people co-create an emotional architecture. And when one person walks away, especially without full emotional resolution, that architecture crumbles, but not all at once, not neatly. What's left behind are fragments of what was and ghosts of who she believed she was becoming. These are not easy things to release. They're not intellectual decisions. They're deep-rooted, often subconscious patterns that need to be grieved and dismantled piece by piece. But that's why emotional attachment can linger long after physical presence is gone. Because she's not just letting go of you, she's letting go of the version of herself that only existed when you were in the room. That version might have been braver, or more vulnerable, or more seen. And sometimes, even in dysfunction, people would rather stay connected to something than risk becoming no one. The pain of losing identity often outweighs the pain of losing love. Now think about how this plays out practically. You stop reaching out. You stop responding. You move on, and she starts spiraling, not just emotionally, but existentially. Because the reflection is gone, the validation is gone, the feedback loop that said, this is who I am in this relationship, has gone silent. And what's left is a gaping hole where that identity used to be. That's not desperation, that's displacement. This is why emotional detachment on your part can feel like punishment to someone who hasn't yet rebuilt their sense of self. To you, it might just be a boundary, a necessary step forward. But to her, it feels like erasure, like being forgotten not just by someone she loved, but by the self she knew through you. And this is where the internal conflict becomes unbearable, because while part of her may know the relationship wasn't sustainable, another part is still desperately trying to hold on to the psychological security it offered, the consistency of having someone to reflect her back to herself. When that disappears, she's not just losing a person, she's losing a mirror. So when you ask why she can't let go emotionally, it's not always because of the strength of the love, it's because of the strength of the identity that was built around it. That's a much harder thing to dismantle. Love can fade, but identity clings. It hides in the crevices of memory, shows up in daily habits, and echoes in moments of silence. Until she learns how to rebuild herself outside of you, the attachment will remain. Not as romance, but as identity preservation. And that's the tragedy of emotional entanglement. We often grieve the loss of someone before we realize what we're truly grieving is the version of ourselves that only existed in their presence. That's why she can't let go. Not yet. Because to let go of you, she must also let go of who she believed she was with you. And that kind of detachment is not just hard, it's terrifying. That's the cost of emotional dependence. It always demands that we lose more than just the other person. Emotional bonds are rarely logical. You can explain the dysfunction, you can list every red flag, you can recall every moment you were disrespected or dismissed, and yet something inside still holds on. That's the paradox of unresolved emotions. And for her, when she can't let go emotionally, it's often because there are still so many questions echoing in her mind that never got answered. So many moments left hanging, like unfinished sentences. And those unresolved threads become emotional loops that refuse to close. They keep her trapped in a psychological cycle that feels impossible to break. You see, when we go through a breakup or an emotional severance, we expect time to do the healing. But time doesn't heal what the mind refuses to understand, and that's where the trap is. She may not be obsessed with you, she might be obsessed with the questions that came from you, the why and the how and the what if. And those questions torment her more than your absence ever could, because if something ends without clarity, it doesn't just feel like loss, it feels like betrayal of logic, of trust, and of self-perception. This is why she replays conversations over and over in her mind, why she remembers things you've long forgotten, why the smallest memory can throw her into a spiral of confusion and longing. It's not always nostalgia, it's often the mind trying to reorganize chaos. The emotional brain cannot accept disorder. It craves narrative. It wants cause and effect. And when the narrative doesn't make sense, it clings to the fragments, hoping that if she just turns them over enough times, they'll finally fit together. That's what keeps her emotionally stuck, not love in the romantic sense, but the compulsion to make sense of the emotional injury. You became a symbol not just of affection, but of confusion, of unfinished understanding. And human beings don't release confusion easily. We fixate on it. We attempt to solve it. We let it infect our peace, because somehow chaos feels more familiar than emptiness. At least in chaos, there's movement. In emptiness, there's just silence. And this silence is particularly loud when she feels like she gave everything, her vulnerability, her trust, her time, and yet she still ended up alone with more questions than closure. That kind of experience doesn't dissolve neatly. It doesn't vanish with distraction or rebound relationships. It lingers because the psyche is still trying to figure out what went wrong. And until she finds a way to give herself a coherent story, she will keep holding on to the one she had with you, even if it's broken, even if it hurts, because it's the only one that still feels real. There's a certain torment that comes from needing closure you're never going to get. And in her case, that torment is compounded by the hope that maybe you'll come back, not because she truly believes the relationship can be repaired, but because she believes that if you return, then at least some of those questions might finally be answered. Maybe then she can stop blaming herself. Maybe then she can stop wondering whether she mattered. Maybe then she can rest. That's the real emotional tether. It's not always about you as a person. It's about the parts of her you left activated. You touched places in her that hadn't been touched before, places of insecurity, of hope, of deep emotional investment, and now those places are open, exposed, and vulnerable. She can't let go, not because she wants to stay tied to the pain, but because letting go means accepting that some things will never be resolved. And that is a brutal truth to swallow, especially for someone who still believes that if she just waits long enough, if she just reflects hard enough, she'll find a missing piece that'll make the heartbreak finally make sense. That's why your silence can be louder than any words you could ever say. That's why distance doesn't equate to detachment in her world. Because emotionally, she's still entangled with the mystery of it all. She still sees your face in moments of reflection, hears your voice in internal dialogue, feels your presence in memories that refuse to decay. Not because she's delusional, but because she hasn't found a way to close the chapter without leaving a part of herself behind. And that's the cost of unresolved emotions. They keep the soul restless. They keep her awake at night, replaying the things she never said, wondering if you ever cared the way she did. And the longer those answers remain hidden, the harder it becomes to detach, because it's not just about letting go of someone, it's about letting go of the hope that one day it might all finally make sense. And that hope, no matter how fragile, is often the last thing to die. Sometimes what keeps a person emotionally tethered isn't the love they still feel, it's the identity they built around that relationship. When she can't let you go, it may not be because she believes the relationship was perfect, or even because she wants it back. It's because during the time she spent with you, a version of herself was formed that she's now unsure how to live without. And that version might have felt alive, needed, valued, or seen in ways she never experienced before. Losing you means losing the mirror that reflected those parts of her back to her. And that can be devastating, not because you were flawless, but because through you, she learned to attach parts of her self-worth. It's easy to think that the end of a relationship only represents the loss of another person. But for many people, it also represents the loss of a self that only existed within that dynamic. Maybe you brought out her nurturing side, or her sense of playfulness, or made her feel admired in a way she hadn't felt before. And now, with your absence, there's an identity vacuum. She's left standing in an emotional wasteland, wondering who she is without that reflection. That confusion can make her feel like she's unraveling, because she was never just mourning you. She's mourning the version of herself she became when she was with you. This attachment isn't necessarily conscious. People don't sit around articulating that they've attached their sense of self to another person. But it shows up in the way they struggle to move forward. It shows up in how difficult it becomes to engage in new relationships without comparing them to the emotional architecture of the one they lost. When someone has used a relationship as a foundation for their self-definition, letting go of that person feels like tearing down their internal scaffolding. And that's terrifying. It can feel like falling into an emotional abyss where nothing feels stable or familiar. There's a quiet panic in realizing that your sense of identity was interwoven with someone who no longer sees you, hears you, or acknowledges you. And for her, that panic doesn't show up as drama. It shows up as hesitation, second-guessing, obsessive thought cycles, and emotional numbness. She might appear strong on the outside, composed even, but internally she's grappling with the question of how to exist in a world where the version of her that felt the most alive is now gone. That's the hidden grief. It's not about missing the day-to-day texts or shared meals or even the intimacy. It's about missing the psychological safety of knowing who she was within that relationship. And when that disappears, the world feels less defined, less meaningful, less secure. You represented a framework, and even if the foundation had cracks, it was still something she could stand on. Now that it's gone, she's not just trying to rebuild her life, she's trying to rebuild herself. And that's far more difficult than most people understand. This is where emotional entanglement becomes most stubborn, because it isn't just about emotional memories. It's about identity reconstruction. It's about finding herself again in the wreckage. And it's not as simple as distraction or dating someone new. That might cover the wound, but it doesn't heal it. Healing comes from facing the reality that who she was in the relationship may have been real, but it isn't the only version of herself that's valid. And until she believes that, she'll remain emotionally attached to what you represented, a portal to a self she hasn't yet found on her own. This is why people often say they feel like they've lost a piece of themselves after a breakup. It's not poetic language, it's neurological truth. The brain, quite literally, maps its understanding of self in relation to others. And when those others leave, the emotional imprint remains. So she keeps circling back emotionally, not because she's weak or desperate, but because the brain is wired to seek coherence. And without you, she's still searching for a new emotional framework that feels as significant and grounding. You may never see this. You may only see the silence, or the distant glances, or the occasional message she never sends. But beneath the surface, she's reconstructing, slowly, painfully. Because for someone who built part of their identity in your presence, letting go isn't just about walking away. It's about finding the courage to rediscover who they are when no one is watching. And that is a journey she must take alone. And in the quiet, when the world is still and there's nothing left to distract her, she realizes that letting go of you isn't the hardest part. The hardest part is believing she's still whole without you. There's a peculiar kind of silence that follows when someone realizes they've lost your emotional availability. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's subtle, but it echoes in every corner of their experience. When she reaches out and finds that you're no longer emotionally responsive, when the warmth of your presence is replaced by a steady indifference, something inside her begins to stir in discomfort. It's not necessarily about missing the relationship itself, or even you as a person. It's the discomfort that comes from being met with emotional emptiness, where once there was depth, and the loss of control that hits when she realizes she no longer influences your internal world. You see, emotional availability is power. And when you offered her that, your presence, your care, your emotional energy, you were giving her access to a sacred space. That emotional energy is what gives relationships meaning. It's what allows connection to deepen. But it's also what makes a person feel significant in your life. So when she sees that you're no longer emotionally available, that your mood doesn't shift with her actions, that your thoughts aren't orbiting around her as they once did, it introduces a level of unfamiliarity that can feel deeply unsettling. It's not just about missing you, it's about the realization that the emotional strings she once tugged on now lie dormant. The way you used to respond to her moods, or defend yourself when she pushed, or chase clarity and chaos, it's all gone. And that absence is louder than any argument or confrontation. It's the kind of silence that exposes the truth. Your emotional energy has moved elsewhere, or perhaps nowhere at all. But either way, it no longer belongs to her. And what's even more painful for her isn't just the fact that you're gone, it's that you no longer react. That's the breaking point, because as long as someone still reacts, they still care. Anger, frustration, even sadness, they're all indicators that there's something still alive in the emotional space between two people. But when you become emotionally unresponsive, not out of malice or manipulation, but out of true detachment, it signals a deeper shift. You're no longer in the psychological equation. And that's what begins to truly haunt her. This emotional neutrality forces her to face a mirror she's been avoiding. Maybe she spent time trying to provoke you, test you, even hurt you emotionally, not necessarily because she wanted to destroy you, but because she wanted to verify that she still mattered. It's a flawed coping mechanism, but a common one. If she could still make you jealous, she mattered. If she could make you break your silence, reach out, fall apart, then your attention was still hers. But when none of that works anymore and your emotional baseline remains steady, something inside her begins to collapse, because now she has to face the truth. The power she once held has disappeared. There's something sobering about seeing someone you once knew intimately look at you with no emotional urgency, and not because they're trying to play a game or prove a point, but because they've genuinely moved beyond the need for emotional reaction. That shift is rare, and when it happens, it cuts deeper than any goodbye ever could. She might not admit it. She might even double down and act like she doesn't care, but deep down, she feels it. She feels the emotional void where your energy used to be, and it disorients her. Because whether she knew it or not, she had become reliant on your emotional feedback to validate her own sense of control, desirability, or meaning within the dynamic. And now, in your absence, she's forced to sit with feelings she once could avoid by pulling at your emotions. In your detachment, she has no more mirrors to reflect herself through, no more emotional leverage. And that forces her into a confrontation, not with you, but with herself. And that's the reckoning that begins the spiral of regret. This is the irony of emotional games. They often backfire, because while they're designed to draw you in, to ignite your reaction, to keep you emotionally tethered, they eventually teach you how to let go. And once you've learned to let go emotionally, you don't go back. Not because of pride or ego or spite, but because your peace has finally become more valuable than the chase. And when she realizes she can no longer reach that part of you, no matter how hard she tries, that's the moment she begins to grieve a version of you that will never return. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any closure could. When she sees you begin to thrive without her, something shifts inside her that she likely didn't anticipate. See, people often believe they're the ones holding the emotional upper hand, especially if they're the one who walked away, or if they thought they had the power to keep your attention indefinitely. There's a quiet arrogance that can develop when someone assumes that you'll always be there, always waiting, always hoping they'll come back. But when you take that energy and reinvest it into yourself, when you stop chasing and begin building, something much more profound happens. You become untouchable. And it's that untouchability that makes her start to question everything. It's not just that you've moved on, it's that you've evolved. That's what stings. Because moving on can sometimes be superficial. People move on with distractions, with rebounds, with noise, but evolving, that's a different kind of separation. That means you've outgrown the very dynamic that once had power over you. And when she sees that, not hears about it, but sees it through your actions, your discipline, your peace, your presence, it creates a discomfort that cuts deep. It's not that she wanted to see you suffer forever, but a part of her may have expected it, maybe even needed it to validate her importance in your life. Because if you were broken without her, it meant she mattered. If you couldn't rebuild, it proved her value. That's the unspoken transaction people don't like to admit. They want to feel irreplaceable. And when you prove otherwise, not through words, but through self-mastery, it forces them to see themselves differently. And that's not a comfortable realization. Thriving isn't about proving anyone wrong. That's still reactive. Thriving is about proving yourself right. It's when you stop asking what went wrong and start asking, what do I need to do now to build a life that no longer depends on someone else's presence for meaning. That shift in perspective changes everything. And when she realizes that your energy is no longer circling her orbit, that you've recentered yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually, there's a weight that drops in her chest. Not necessarily because she wants to come back, but because now she knows she couldn't even if she tried. You're no longer emotionally accessible. That's what thriving does. It doesn't just change your outer life, it builds internal gates. It means your time, your thoughts, your emotions, they're no longer for sale at a discount. And when she starts to recognize that, when she senses that, she doesn't just lack your attention, but your availability. She begins to grieve not just you, but the role she once played in your life. That's the part no one tells you about healing. It reorders everything. It doesn't just patch the wounds, it changes your taste. You stop desiring what drained you, you stop chasing what confused you, and you start creating from a place of clarity, not need. And that's when she realizes you're not pretending to be okay, you are okay. You're not masking pain with productivity, you've genuinely transmuted it into purpose. And that kind of transformation is undeniable. It might come in waves for her. She may not feel the regret all at once. It could be subtle at first. A random memory that doesn't sting you anymore. A text she sends that you don't reply to. A story she posts that you don't view. And slowly she realizes your silence isn't a strategy, it's a new standard. Your absence isn't an emotional ploy, it's your new reality. And that's what begins to unravel her sense of certainty. Because what thriving reveals is not just who you are becoming, but who they never really saw you were to begin with. And now, in your absence, she's finally beginning to see it, not through your validation, but through the undeniable evidence of your evolution. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic goodbye. Just growth. Quiet, disciplined, focused growth. It's the most humbling mirror you can hold up to someone who took your presence for granted. You don't have to explain your journey, just keep walking. When she realizes that you're no longer emotionally accessible, not because you're being cold or vindictive, but because you've genuinely reclaimed your peace, it forces her into a reckoning she didn't expect. See, people often play emotional games, sometimes without even fully knowing they're doing it. They test, they pull, they retreat, hoping to feel in control of the dynamic. But what happens when the other person no longer engages? When your emotions are no longer available to be manipulated? Not because you're trying to punish anyone, but because you've simply withdrawn your energy to protect what's sacred within you. There comes a moment when she notices the stillness, your silence, your lack of response, your absence of emotional investment. It's not the silence of pettiness, it's the silence of someone who's no longer on the battlefield. You've walked off. You've dropped the sword, stepped outside the drama, and realized that your well-being is too valuable to be caught in a loop of confusion. That kind of silence speaks louder than any words ever could. And she feels it deeply. This is when she starts to regret the space you once occupied in her life, not just because you're gone, but because you're gone without residue. You're not tethered to her through lingering hopes or emotional dependence. You're not checking her updates. You're not wondering what could have been. You're not keeping a door open in case she decides to come back. That door is closed, not slammed, not locked out of anger, but gently, firmly shut. That's what really hits her. She didn't just lose your attention, she lost access to your soul. You see, emotional accessibility is one of the most powerful gifts a person can offer. When you love someone, when you care, when you show up consistently, that's not weakness, that's strength. But when that strength is misunderstood or taken for granted, there comes a point where withholding it isn't about revenge, it's about alignment. You begin to realize that your time, your emotional bandwidth, your inner peace, these things are not infinite. And giving them to someone who doesn't honor them becomes a betrayal of self. And when she can no longer reach you emotionally, when she tries to reconnect and finds nothing to hold on to, not even resistance, that's when regret takes hold. Because regret doesn't always come from missing a person. It often comes from recognizing the depth of what you misread. She starts to remember the way you listened when no one else did, the way you remained solid even when she was unpredictable, the way you loved without calculation. And she understands, perhaps too late, that what she had wasn't ordinary. It was rare, it was grounding, and it's no longer available. It's in this quiet realization that something begins to unravel inside her, not just nostalgia, but grief, the kind that comes when you recognize what you dismissed was in fact the very thing you needed. And that grief has no remedy. It's not the kind of pain that can be soothed by a new relationship or a few weeks of distraction, because it wasn't about losing a person. It was about losing the opportunity to grow with someone who saw you clearly and still chose you. You didn't have to make a grand statement. You didn't need a dramatic exit. You just changed direction. And that change didn't just disrupt the emotional dynamic, it rewrote it entirely. She's now left with the echoes of a connection she thought she controlled, but control is an illusion when respect is absent. And once you remove your emotional presence from someone's life, it's only then that they start to understand its weight. This is why walking away fully, completely, peacefully is sometimes the most impactful thing you can do. Not because it hurts the other person, but because it finally communicates in no uncertain terms that you value yourself enough to stop participating in cycles that diminish you. Your absence becomes the consequence they never anticipated. And in that space, without confrontation or chaos, they're forced to confront what they refused to see when you were still offering them pieces of yourself. So let them sit with the silence. Let them feel the void your presence once filled. And let that be the lesson they carry forward. Not for your sake, but for theirs. Because sometimes the deepest regret isn't about what we lost, but about what we never truly appreciated when we had it. You didn't lose anything by walking away. You found yourself.